Well, good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's program with Deborah and James Fallows, which kicks off the 8th annual ChinaFest here at the University of Richmond. I'm George Pangburn. I'm a member of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at University of Richmond, which provides opportunities for individuals age 50 and better here on this lovely campus. We have details about the Osher program. There are some of these programs out in the lobby, and you can also see what the Osher program here is all about by going to the website at osher.richmond.edu. And as I mentioned, the copies of the schedule are on the book signing table. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin tonight's program. If you haven't already, it would be a good thing to turn off your cell phones at this time. We all know what that's like. Restrooms and water fountains are in the just outside the doors here in the lobby. And during the program, fellow Osher member Marshall, and I will be handing out note cards for you to write your questions. We'll collect those cards between the two speakers and then funnel them to answer during the Q&A session. Following the talk itself, there'll be a book sale and signing by our two presenters in the lobby just outside the auditorium. It's a real privilege for the Osher Institute to be a co-sponsor of this program. I want to particularly recognize Dr. Irby Bland Brown, who serves on the advisory group for ChinaFest, and who introduced the Osher Institute to the ChinaFest program. Dr. Brown is Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Richmond and served as a member of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute Steering Committee. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Rose Nanping Chin, the founder of the Rose Group, which is an organic body of people who share the conviction as well as the passion to foster better understanding and goodwill between the United States and China through media presentation and exchange. This group was envisioned by Rose after September 11th, 2001. Born and raised in Taiwan, Rose has been a longtime devotee in community service and bridge building. And with that, Rose Chen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for this very kind introduction. At this time, I would like to ask our presenters, James, Deborah Fallows, and moderator Alex to come on stage. Since the very beginning, Osher has been a great partner, and it's our privilege and honor to be held our annual opening lectures here on the beautiful U of R campus. And Jen Dalwick has been instrumental in doing everything, but she has a retreat and she couldn't be here. And we're blessed to have George, Pam, and Marshall here to help us out. I would like to, we are very, very honored to have a very distinguished panel here tonight to start our program. To my immediate right, Alex Nargis is, without introduction, everyone knows him. He's the director of Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the newly renovated museum has put Richmond on the map. It has staged from Picasso, Fabergé, and just finished the Chihuly, big blockbuster shows. And in related to China on 2014, Palace Museum will have things coming over here, and Li Jian is the curator, happened to be in attendance here. And the other aspect is Virginia Museum of Fine Arts will be the first American museum to have its collection shown in Beijing, the Palace Museum, so which is remarkable. And of course, I have to mention we had the Family Day on Saturday at the Museum of Fine Arts, and which has becoming a signature event. Thank you very much, Alex. And Alex, you know, you are here for a reason. I think 3 years ago, you gave Catherine a Christmas gift, a book. a little book.
Oh, right.
And Catherine was so thrilled, and she said to me, Rose, you got to read this little book. And it's Deborah's Dreaming in Chinese. So make a long story short, we have them both here. And the Fallows, they started their shared journey in Oxford. Deborah is a Harvard-trained linguist, and James is a Rhodes Scholar there. And from there, they travel, they have a journey of exploration all around the world, live in Ghana, Japan, Malaysia, and
Texas.
Texas. That's good. That's a country in its own. Yes, yeah.
That's exotic.
But I think 2006 and 2009, they had the rare opportunity to go to China and live there for 3 years. He's been the national correspondent for Atlantic Monthly, and Deborah is the Pew Internet project, working on that project. And from that, they produce 3 beautiful books. Hers is Seeing China Through the Lens of Language. And her snippets of the daily interaction with the ordinary Chinese and her adventure of trying to apply what she learned to understand the country and its people. To me, it's just like a dancing style. Delicious morsels of tidbits, but it shows so much about China and stuff, and we are hungry for more, Deborah, yeah. And for James, he's, of course, he used his journalist eye to see things, and he also has a great passion for flying. He's a licensed pilot. So he has this unique vantage point. He sees the big picture. He's stay above the ground. And then he also has a very keen observation and give us peoples and events and stuff to highlight a certain aspect of China. If you haven't read the book, please go get it when we have it after this thing. And for me, I was born and raised in China, in Taiwan, visiting China for the first time in '91. And my parents lived in Beijing for 18 years, so I had frequent visit there. I would say, combine the 3 books they have written about China, it would be the best that you can get a real sense about China. So here we are. We were so honored to have you here in Richmond, Virginia. Not Texas, not any exotic place, but it's a good old Richmond, Virginia. Thank you.
Rose, thank you so much for inviting us and for that wonderful introduction. We really appreciate it. Jim and I are delighted to be here at the University of Richmond. It's the first, we've been to Richmond, but never to this lovely university, so it's a real treat for us. And we thank them and also Rose and the Rose Group. And also the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute has been a big part of our invitation too. We're very grateful for that. So we're going to talk from 2 different perspectives tonight. And kind of continuing the tidbit morsel metaphor here. You can think of me as the appetizer, and Jim is going to be the meat and potatoes. So we're the yin and yang that makes up the whole meal, right? Okay. So I will start with a little bit of the soft stuff. When we first decided to go to China about 7 years ago, we did as much as we could to prepare, which is woefully little for when you're going to a place like China. But it's always been my job in the family to try to tackle a little bit of the language. My background is in languages and linguistics, and that is how I've spent most of my professional life. So we didn't have the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute near us in Washington, but I went to Georgetown to the night and continuing ed program to study Chinese for about a year. Just to show you that it's not the Osher Institutes, when we first got to China, to Shanghai, it was such a shock to me because I thought, okay, I can handle this. You know, I'd been studying for a year. I could at least say a little bit. But when we landed in Shanghai, I couldn't understand a single word, and I couldn't say a single word. It was so bad and so shocking to me that I thought perhaps Meng Laoshe, my teacher at Georgetown, had been teaching us Cantonese instead of Mandarin. But seeing that it was important to continue with this language, I decided that I needed to put that aside and really double down. So fortunately, there are a lot of commercial schools you can go to study Mandarin in China. And I found one that I thought would be the answer to my prayers. It was called Miracle Mandarin. And it was just up the road from us. And you know, I later found out that it was both a combination of the Shanghai dialect, which is nothing like Mandarin, that was flummoxing me at the beginning, and which was what, you know, the taxi drivers and the shopkeepers were speaking, and also the Shanghai accent, which is so different from Beijing, where you get all of those RR pirate sounds. And Shanghai is a very southern accent, kind of like Texas compared to Boston. So it was a challenge. But as I saw more how critical it was going to be to learn Chinese and got farther into the study, I realized that this was a language that just captured my interest entirely. It's a very difficult language, to say the least, but from a linguistic point of view, it did a lot of funny things that languages don't usually do. For example, there are no tenses, which you think is a great thing because you don't have to force feed all of these endings, but just do it with context. And then there are tones, which of course is the bane of every foreigner's existence. And you think, why in the world would a language have tones? But so as I got into the language more, I noticed a lot of interesting things about the language and would try to pursue them from a linguistic point of view, and then pretty quickly found that not only was it teaching me a lot about the language and about how to use the language, but I was also connecting it to things that I saw in our everyday life in China, and found that it was really demystifying that experience for me. It would go a long way toward explaining things that I didn't understand or that were confusing, or just kind of deciphering some of the mysteries of everyday life. And that combination of having the language explain things in the culture was not only a wonderful thing to have happen, but it was really my salvation for my existence in China, which was a very, I'm sure that most of you have been traveling there. It's such an overwhelming country that you kind of need something to grab onto. If you're an artist, you can grab onto the artistic experience. If you're a foodie, there's a lot to choose from. But as a linguist, it was the language that really helped me get a foothold. So what I'd like to just describe for you are a couple of examples of what I mean by using the language to get into the culture. I've chosen a few of them tonight, just two that I want to talk about. The first one is, as I got into speaking Chinese, I had this really odd sensation that no matter how I was saying things, I always felt a little bit abrupt and short, and even to the point of being rude. For example, if we were in a restaurant and the server comes and said, in Chinese, would you like a glass of water? You say, 不要, don't want, which is very short. And as a Westerner, you kind of want to add the, if somebody says that to you in English in Richmond, you say, oh, no, thanks, I don't want water now. Thanks a lot, that's really nice, but I'll have some later. Thanks very much. Just kind of going on in this vein. But 不要, that's what you do, and kind of stop right there. It's the same thing with pleases and thank yous. I realized about 6 months into our time in China, I didn't know how to say please, which usually comes out in lesson 1 or 2 of what you do. And I had to go to our teacher and say, how do you say please? And then a lot of our Chinese friends would say to me, what is it about these Westerners? You're always saying thank you for everything. Thank you, thank you, thank you. No, just give it up already. We don't say thank you. So there were these funny kinds of hints that I knew I was saying things properly, but I just felt rude. And it was in great contrast when I started looking around life as we were living it in China, that I would see what I interpreted as a great disconnect between this language and the very polite gestures or protocols that I saw. For example, we're in a restaurant, and at the table next to us, everybody sits at the big round tables, and you share the food, kind of passing it around, and the host will use the big chopsticks, take out the tofu from the main dish, put it on everyone's plates on either side of him before serving yourself, or the hostess might pour the beer or the Coke for everyone, or the tea, before serving herself. And it's a very protocoled, choreographed expression of how you act. And then, in the middle of this, there was a table next to us of a family. The little boy was kind of nudging his mom and said, "给我盐," which means the equivalent of, "give me the salt." So if you're a Westerner and a mom who's been trying to raise kids, it was all I could do from jump up and say, say please, ask for that salt. So I went home to my language monographs and dictionaries and grammars and things, and this was actually the only time that I came upon the perfect explanation of what I had seen in Chinese. And this was by a Chinese linguist named Kadijan. He says, using a phrase as please, as in please pass the salt, actually has the opposite effect of politeness here in China. The Chinese way of being polite to each other with words is to shorten the social distance between you. So saying please serves to insert a kind of buffer between you and the person, a kind of formality that says we need some space between us. So it comes not to be an expression of politeness and closeness, but one, please really means, back off a little bit. This is much more formal. So that kind of realization was really interesting to show me that things are really not what they seem. What I saw as abruptness was actually politeness, and that there is this complex set of linguistic and cultural rules between English and Chinese that just don't match, and it takes quite an effort to reinterpret how those work. The second example I want to tell you about is about the word love. And in any language, this is a word that is really fraught. But I started to notice odd things about the word love, ai, in Chinese, back in 1986, when we first went to China with our two then very small children. And this was the time, of course, where you show up as a Westerner in China and everyone, they won't let you go, especially if you have two little blonde boys, as we did then. So we were there with a group of Esperanto speakers. It was their international congress, and that, maybe Jim will tell that story. That's another story altogether, how we got to China. But we were on a bus tour with this group in southern China. And I was next to a Chinese woman, and she was looking at our two boys about this high and this 9 and 6 or something at that point, and looking at me back and forth, and she said to me, "Which one do you love more?" And I was horrified. No, how could of course I love them both the same. That just pops out of your mouth. And she hemmed and hawed a little bit and said, "But really, which one do you love more?" She just wasn't going to let that go. So I filed it away and thought, odd, I don't understand what's going on here. So fast forward 20 years later, and we show up in China. And at that point, this was 6 years ago or so, we made a lot of friends who were mixed couples, let's say a Chinese wife and a Western man. When we got to know them a little bit better, we would inevitably have this conversation where the Chinese man would start complaining about his wife. No, the American man or Western man would start complaining about his Chinese wife, saying, "She'll never say I love you, no matter what it is. She won't say I love you. She won't say 我爱你, I love you in Chinese. She won't say I love you in English. I feel hurt." And then the Chinese wife would say, you know, my husband, he's just saying, I love you, I love you, I love you all the time. It's so gratuitous. It's so meaningless. There's nothing. Why is he saying this? So it was this conversation around the word love, just never meeting between them. And then there was a third example. I had befriended a young Chinese woman who was in her mid-30s, very professional. She had a husband. She had a cute little kid. She had a professional job. Her life seemed great. And as is also the way with Chinese women, you very quickly get into a very personal relationship. So, you know, asking personal questions, not only how old are you, how much money do you make, what is your rent, but things like that. So she said to me, you must love your husband very much. You've been married for a long time. So we have been married. But I thought, how odd, you know, what are you going to say? So I said, well, yes, I do love him very much, and then kind of lamely said to her, and I'm sure you love your husband very much too. And she said, I love him for now. So now, giving her the benefit of the doubt, because, you know, there are no tenses in Chinese, right? I thought, okay, maybe she's overcompensating a little bit. She doesn't quite have the tense thing down. She's saying it in an existential way, like, I am loving him forever, or whatever. Or maybe she's just a very pragmatic Chinese woman, and that was it. I love him for now. There was not a good linguistic explanation for this, but I was just kind of looking around about the notions of love and marriage over time in Chinese history, and found, you know, back in Confucian times, in imperial times, this sense of love and marriage was very strong, a sense of harmony, obedience, regulation. It was very programmed. During the Maoist times, it was more egalitarian, but with a strong politically correct overtone. And now, it's really kind of everything goes. You have a revival of Confucianism, and then you have a sense of very modern love. And I just want to read you these couple paragraphs here that described what I saw and how I think it's really a good representation of the situation about love in China right now. The Cherry Blossom Spring Flower Festival this year happened to coincide with the first gloriously warm and clear weekend days of the season. All of Beijing was out of doors after the dank and dreary winter. We saw young couples everywhere. They filled the subways and the parks that day, all locked in embrace. They held hands, they hugged, they kissed, they spooned, all mindless of the careless their careless public display. I would say that these are the youth of the marry for love generation. Had it been the same day, and had we been in Shanghai's People's Park instead, we would no doubt have again seen the serious matchmaking meetings we observed there every weekend that we lived in Shanghai. Parents in their 50s worried over their unmarried offspring in their late 20s. They would gather in the northwest corner of their park with their homemade signs describing their children. This son was born in the year of the monkey, 1.8 meters tall, had a job in a small private company, type A blood. That daughter was a graduate of East China Normal University, 1.6 meters tall, type A blood, Han ethnic group. The parents would circle around tentatively, reading each other's posters, huddling with their spouses, and perhaps sidling toward another couple to strike up a conversation and see where things would go from there. Their grown children were never in evidence. Who knows? They may have been locked in embrace in the number 2 subway line at that very moment. These were adults from a very different era, and they were still trying to arrange marriages for their very modern youth. So I thought that this notion of love and this sense that you got of love was actually a wonderful metaphor for how China is changing right now and how hard it is to keep track of everything, but how you just see it unfolding over time, fast forward. So that is my sense of how the language caught my attention, how I tried to follow it through from a linguistic point of view, and how it helped me to interpret a lot of the really puzzling and amazing things that we saw in China every day on the streets. So with that, I will give you the main course.
As we say, I love her for now. and for all these long years since we first met on a blind date in college. So it's a real pleasure for Deb and me to be here. We're grateful to Rose and to the university and the Osher Institute and to Alex and the museum and all of you for coming out. And of course, I'm most grateful to have a chance to appear with Deb and to follow her presentation. We have seen lots of the world together. Let me tell you what the next three acts of the presentation are going to be. We're now going to have a slideshow for a few minutes. And the reason is going to set up some of the policy points I'm going to be making for you. They illustrate some of the social points Deb is talking about, but also some of the policy points. So we're going to see the slideshow. I'm going to make some brief comments about them. Deb can chime in whenever I've mistakenly expressed what we're seeing in the pictures. And the reason we're going to show you these pictures, how many people have been in China? I assume most of you have been here. How many of you have been to interior cities like in Gansu or Sichuan or whatever? And how many of you have been there for like more than a couple of months, a stretch? And so it's, I think the longer we were in China, every time we got on a bus or got on a train or took a boat or took an airplane, we got off on the other end, we just couldn't believe what we were seeing at the other end. And so just a sense of the expanse of the country, that's the next course of the little slideshow. Then I'm going to give you the policy point interpretation of what we've just seen. And then we're going to have a discussion of what we've left out, I think questions you've asked. Deb can correct me and Alex can correct me too. So that is the plan. Let's go to the slideshow now. So the lights, whoever is in charge of this can, so these are all things that we saw with our own actual eyes and over the last 6 or 7 years. They're not professional pictures, but they're a sense of just the range of things. Okay, this was, let me see if we can get this to the slideshow version. Is there anybody besides me who has control of the system? Actually, I think there's a computer in here. Talk among yourselves for a minute.
Technologically deficient, so. Right, just a bit. There you go. And I didn't realize until.
I didn't work at Microsoft for 6 months for nothing. Okay, so this, as you know, is downtown Shanghai. The weirdo building in the middle was an exposition center that was built during the Soviet era. What I loved is during our time in Shanghai, there was the Chinese sex toys industry convention that was held there. There's some of the modern hotels around Shanghai. This was the view out of our window in Tomorrow Square in Shanghai. That's what we see. We're going to be there again next week, and I'm sure there'll be some new buildings in that view. During the time we were in Shanghai, 2 entire new subway lines were created with the People's Square Park in the bottom. You see in the distance on the right, Pudong. This is the main entrance to the largest factory on Earth. This is the Foxconn factory in southern China. I do this, I finally, about 3 months ago, got into this factory. And on the Atlantic site, not here, I have a whole lot of pictures of what it is like inside the Foxconn factory. It's famous in the rest of the world for having suicide nets and things like that. It was surprising to me for actually how nice it was by Chinese standards. I may say a word about that. This, on the other hand, this was a guy just in Shanghai. So you see the biggest factories in the world, you see scenes like this. This was the Qingdao International Beer Festival. This was shortly, this was the Budweiser tent. And this was shortly before the Beijing Olympics. Qingdao was the home of the sailing events. A disappointing factor of beer festivals in China. Number one, they serve Chinese beer. But number two, you get your beer in plastic like garbage sacks, and you walk around with a straw. It's efficient. This also is the Qingdao International Beer Festival. Chinese people there's an idea of China as the workhouse of the world, which is true in certain ways, but I think Chinese people have a great ability to take their leisure as it offers itself. This was a display we saw in Shanghai. They were doing Can't Buy Me Love. This was, again, part of the idea of just the real estate boom that is taking over the country and the mixture of styles and the clash of cultures Deb was mentioning. And these are the people Deb was talking about. These are the Shanghai matchmakers. The poster, if we could see it, would say the blood type, the salary and all the rest of the child. So that's a deal being made. Another guy, and so this, what I love, this is a trash picker, but he's texting. There's no place in China I was ever without a mobile phone signal, including in a coal mine. There's nobody in China who doesn't have a this guy too, with his text phone. So this is, again, Shanghai recently. It's 1 million cars, 1 billion cars, but also people on bikes. This is a Shanghai classroom during wintertime. Shanghai is officially a hot city because it's south of the Yangtze River. Therefore, it doesn't need to be heated. So this, you'll notice how the children are dressed. And if you were there, you would see little clouds of vapor forming there. You'll also notice there seem to be more boys than girls. That's partly just the general demographics of China. Partly, this was a very working class city, working class part of Shanghai, and it cost to go to public school. So it's more likely to send your son to public school than your daughter. It's a young American teaching English there. You've heard about pollution in China. I'll say more. This was an actually okay day in Beijing while the CCTV tower is being built. This was a somewhat less nice day from Shanghai, the same view you saw before. Another ordinary day from our Beijing apartment, et cetera. And this is part of the reason why. This is on Beijing's third ring road, a man peddling charcoal briquettes. Theoretically, they can't be used for heating within the fourth ring road, but theory and practice have their distance, often in China. This was 3 days before the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics from our apartment in Beijing. So it was a miracle in many ways that the second day of the Olympics things were cleaned up. On the other hand, who's been into Gansu province? Now, Gansu is a beautiful area. I think of it as sort of the Montana or Wyoming of China, of spectacular areas. So we were out there for a while seeing some communities. This is some of the oldest part of the Great Wall there still in Gansu. To give you an idea of just the extent of China. You hear about 500 million peasants. This is the kind of people we're talking about. It's also striking in so many parts of rural China. You'll see retirement age people, which in China means sort of Osher Institute eligible people, and which there's a mandatory retirement age of 50 or 55 in most large institutions. And there's school-age children and not the people of working age who are in the city. So they're bringing in the harvest in Gansu. Again, the same farm family there, little kids doing the work. And this was an aerial view of these kinds of how they're the only machines we saw there are the little blue bikes and the rusted out satellite dishes. I think those are not connected anymore, but at some time they must have been. And you'll see here, to me, this is China. This is also Gansu, a place called Yellow Sheep River. You see the nice Bruegel painting landscape of all the little haystacks in perfect order and the houses, and you see a cable coming through the middle. That's fiber optic cable that's being brought to that village as part of the modernize the west of China policy that was underway there. This is also I think this is in a nearby area, an ethnically Tibetan area, and the Tibetan part doesn't signify, but this was a room in which 17 junior high school girls live. So they sleep on 9 on the bottom and 8 on the top, with their heads to the left, their feet to the right. All of their clothes are in the thing on the gray thing on the right, and their tea thermoses are on the bottom. The reason that things like this struck us is there's the idea of China as this unstoppable juggernaut, which much of it is, but they still have more people who live this way than America has people. And it is a gigantic concern and struggle for people in China. Again, a similar village of how people were living. On the other hand, this guy is not yet a billionaire, but he's close. I'm going to show you where he lives. He has his own Air Force. He's invented an environmentally friendly air conditioning company that has great sales in countries where the electric supply is shaky, like in Pakistan, India, and parts of China. His name is Mr. Zhang. I spent a lot of time with him. He's a good friend of Al Gore's, and I was there for something too complicated to explain, but this is one of the main buildings on his campus, a scale replica of the Palace of Versailles. This is in a place outside Changsha where he lives and works. This is another view of part of his buildings. That's part of his Air Force. He also has a jet and some Cessnas and his own little airstrip. This is his workforce. I wrote a story about them in the Atlantic having their morning exercises. On the other hand, we have, this is in Hunan, where Chairman Mao's original era. Again, I'm showing this again just for the extent of things. This was a restaurant where Deb and I had Chairman Mao's pork. How many people have had that? I think that's what we call fatback in the U.S. It's a lots of fat, and there was no joking. In Shanghai, a picture like that would be sold as camp. In Hunan, it was entirely sincere, and that's the village. This. Have any of you been to Xinjiang? Xinjiang is the autonomous region in the northwest of China. It's almost a fifth of the country's territory. It's very harsh territory, and the ethnic population are Uyghurs, who are Turkish people. They don't look like the rest of Chinese people. They speak a different language. They usually learn Chinese as a second language when they go to college. And this was opening day at Xinjiang Provincial University, where the man on the right was the Chinese as second language teacher, and the people on the left were coming in as students to get their Chinese as second language textbooks. Again, the point was, it's a big, roiling, diverse country. This is an internet cafe that we saw, and I think it was in Nanjing. These are all over the place. People may be hacking into the Pentagon as we watch. Probably comes from places like this. This also is an internet cafe. This is in Sichuan. This is about maybe 3 hours west of Chengdu. This was an internet cafe, and this is how it looks inside. These may also be hacking inside the Pentagon. You know, anything is possible, but they were playing games, most of what they were doing. This is a mountain of coal, 2 mountains of coal. In Shandong province, this is a place where the people's face was black with coal dust most of the time. Again, the sign of the environmental challenge. China now burns more coal than the rest of the world combined, and is in a furious race between its need for power and its desire to clean it up. This is a man who was in charge of cleaning up all that coal, and he had set a target of when it would be much cleaner, and he said he wanted to see it during his lifetime. He's a 3-pack-a-day smoker, so he is accelerating the timeline for getting his work done. This is the guy on the left is the guy who was in charge of cleaning up the air for the Beijing Olympics, and so I spent a lot of time with him during the build-up, and that also worked out okay. Communist Party boss on the right, Taiwanese philanthropist on the left. So meetings of different cultures in China. Panda. This is in the now destroyed Wulong Panda Reserve. Pandas en masse. The man who has spent 20 years at this reserve caring for pandas, he knows English to say to me in English for quotation, "The more I know the panda, the more I love the panda." He's a wonderful guy. I'm going to show you in 2 slides the difference between China and Japan, and we're near the end here. As Rose was saying, I'm an avid pilot. I was involved in a couple of ferry flights of planes around Asia. This was fueling a plane in Japan for a trip to China. Any of you who know Japan will know this scene. Identical uniforms, a protective cuff around the fueling vent, gloves, the shoelaces are the same color. That's a safety checklist on one of the guy's fronts. So here's a close-up. So this is how things are done in Japan. The same plane being refueled in China, it happened this way. And so this is, it's a barrel of avgas, a poor guy filling out. And I love China because of these 2 things. The moral of this is in Japan, there is the way to do things. In China, they find a way to do things. And I really do love that. I think anybody who's been in China knows scenes like this. This poor guy who got no sympathy from the ones who weren't. So this is after the Sichuan earthquake, little kids who'd been displaced, just sort of amusing themselves. More little kids in some of the earthquake zones. This is you notice the size of this uniform. This was in Ningxia. This was another really region near the Yellow River. Notice the size of the clothes. They buy school uniforms every 3 years. The first year they're too big. The second year they fit. The third year they're too small. This is 1 billion plus 3 people living this way. And this was, when we think of the teeming masses of China, we think of things like this, of just all these families and kids we saw around the place. This was in a rural part of Gansu. That is the video portion of the presentation. Let me now go to a brief what this all means part of the presentation, and then we'll be happy to have our discussion. I'd like to talk about 3 different areas relatively briefly, and we can expand on them afterwards. First, how the world looks right now from China's perspective, which is really different from ours. Second, the whole US-China conundrum and some of the things that are creating tension there at the moment. And third, specific exhortations and advice to Americans in Richmond or DC or wherever else as they think about China in the years ahead and as they prepare student-age Americans for dealings with China. First, the world from China's perspective. There are two things that I try. First, I have two perceptual things, then a couple of things that would be on your mind if this were a similar gathering of the Osher Institute in Beijing or in Tianjin or wherever else. One is, I think that Americans, it's really hard for people who haven't been there to imagine the size of China in a couple of different ways. One is the size in terms of just the number of people you have to deal with. And this is finally the comparison which made it comprehensible to me. The arable land in China is about equal to the US east of the Mississippi. You know, the total land mass is about like the US, but east of the Mississippi is about as much arable land as they have. They don't have any California. They don't have some of the fertile lands of the Great Plains that we do. In that area, east of the Mississippi, they have the equivalent of the whole population of the US, the whole population of Brazil, everybody in Mexico, everybody in the Americas as an entirety, you know, the Caribbean, Argentina, all the rest, plus Nigeria, plus Japan. All those people east of the Mississippi, that is just the scale of everything that comes through. This is why a party boss told me early on, everybody in the US or in the Western world thinks of things in China being multiplied by 1.3 billion. We always think of them being divided by 1.3 billion of opportunity, land, and all the rest. The other aspect of the scale that's hard to convey, and the reason we had these pictures, is just the differentness of the place. I have a little passage on that in my book, my latest book, China Airborne. I won't read that to you in the interest of time. If you beg me, I will later, or you can always buy it and read it to yourself. But it's just the sense that this is, it's more diverse than the US is, except in the specific classification of racial diversity, and much more natural to think of it as an entire continent. Think of it as Europe that happens to be congealed as one nation, but just a hugely shambling place where the image of the Beijing Olympic opening ceremony of everybody working in perfect precision, that is like 1/1,000,000th of the reality there. And the rest of it, as you saw, is nobody knows what's going on. People are working out improvisations. Also, this is still in the how the world looks from China's perspective. If you were in China right now, you would probably not be taking seriously the press in the US over the last 10 years of the unstoppable juggernaut, China conquering the world. Instead, you'd have the following items on your worry list, and I could give you 3 hours on each of those. I'll just give you 30 seconds on each of them. First, you'd have real economic worries. And Americans would think, how can that possibly be? China makes everything. The reason you'd have economic worries is wondering whether China has sort of stalled itself in what they call the low-wage trap. Deb will hold up at this point either my MacBook Air or my phone. These are two props. Let's use the MacBook Air. You've seen them yourself. I've seen them. Thank you. Thank you, Vanna. So it's, you know, they're made in those factories in Foxconn. Let's say it cost $1,000. Of that $1,000, maybe $90 stays in China. The rest goes to Apple, it goes to Intel, it goes to Japanese screen makers, it goes to FedEx, it goes to the retailer. And there's almost nothing you can think of where China has sort of the corporate value added that goes with advanced Western corporations, because they make things for Apple, they make things for Siemens, they make things for GE. They don't have their own Apple, Siemens, GE, Google, et cetera. So without belaboring it, the whole theme of China Airborne is whether they're going to be able to make this transition. Because to make the transition, there's a lot of other things that would need to change in China too. Independent universities, intellectual property laws, et cetera. That's one big problem. Are they topping out? A second problem is the environment, which is just an absolute emergency in my view. And I mean, my view doesn't matter. In the view of a lot of Chinese people, there's been a significant factor in the last 2 months when finally the press has been allowed to report that what you're seeing in Beijing is not mist, but this god-awful pollution, and that there's really a health hazard. There was a report 3 days ago that the water in most 64% of Chinese cities is so-called severely polluted, something that no major city in Western Europe or North America is now classified as. So you have air is very dangerous in many big Chinese cities. The food supply is a real problem. The water is tainted. There are cancer epidemics, birth defect epidemics. I think the government recognizes this is the gravest emergency for the country, and they're trying very hard. They announced a carbon tax yesterday, which is a gigantic step and one the U.S. might emulate. But the environment, you'd be worried about that. You'd be worried next about social tensions. The extremes in the society. You saw the man with the Palace of Versailles. You saw the people pulling their carts. They're living in the same society. The extremes are growing wider and wider and wider. It's not that then the top is going up, and a lot of people feel they are sort of plateauing. And so whether a society that for 30 years has been based on everybody being better off than they were before, how long that can last, more to say about that. Next on your worry list would be the legitimacy of the government. Here's an illustration of the difference in transparency between the U.S. and Chinese governing systems. We both had new presidents chosen last November, as you may recall, here in this crucial swing state of Virginia. Here we knew every single thing that could be possibly known about any candidate for president that we could ever want to know about. We know about Herman Cain. We know about Michelle Bachmann. We know all these things. In China, nobody really knew for sure whether there were going to be 7 or 9 members on the new Standing Committee of the Politburo, until somebody with an overhead camera at the stage where they're being introduced saw there were only 7 X's on the stage, not 9, on the 2 minutes before they were introduced. You have a system that has worked but has real challenges to its legitimacy. You have diplomatic challenges that I won't even go into. And then you have finally a real debate in China about whether their model is the right one. Again, I've seen fascinating debates in Shanghai and other places where they're allowed, usually conducted in English as opposed to Chinese, about whether the Chinese model is sort of coming to the end of its viability after these 30 years of magnificent economic achievement, or whether in fact it'll get through the challenges of the future. So these are just markers for later discussion, but if you were a Chinese group right now, I think you would be more worried about the problems facing you than a comparable American group would be. America has relatively mild problems, which we may not ever get around to solving, but the problems are relatively mild. China has really serious problems that they might solve, but that's worth bearing in mind. So that's category 1, how the world looks from China. It looks not as rosy as we might suggest. Category 2, U.S.-China. What happened 41 years ago today? The Honorable Richard Nixon got off his plane in China and began this first historic visit. Since that time, I argue that no aspect of U.S. foreign policy has been more consistent than our policy towards China, which has involved these 3 continuing themes. Number 1, we think it's better to view them as a potential partner than a certain enemy. That is, not having a Cold War relationship, but saying it's better for us to try to work with them than work against them. Number 2, it's better for us if they rise than if they don't. That is, the argument being that their prosperity will overall make the world better, them better, and us better than if they stagnate, simmer. The only thing more difficult than a rich China would be a poor China by this analysis. And number 3, the argument would be we're still going to disagree about a lot and pretty intensely on human rights issues, on diplomatic issues, et cetera. And every president from Nixon to Obama, I think, has had some version of that combo. It's being, so I think, number 1, we have this combination. Number 2, it is striking if you think how enormous the change in world politics by China's rise is, that it's been as relatively managed and peaceful as it has been over the last now 40 years. That the U.S. has not tried to not sought out head-on confrontation with China or vice versa. This is a gigantic change that I think has been well managed by the governments on both sides most of the time, with some obvious exceptions. And historically, I think it's interesting that this big a change has as few inevitable collisions as it does. But number three, we're having some of those collisions now. I'll tell you later if you want about the hacking episodes, which I've spent a lot of time learning about. I wrote an article in The Atlantic when Deb's email was taken over a couple of years ago by people in West Africa, not in China, but the Chinese assault is very important. Something to bear in mind is that the U.S. cyber resources for doing unto others are very advanced too. And anybody you ask in China about this will say the U.S. is no slouch in this regard. The South China Sea is an area of problem too, but I'll just say we have another range of issues coming up. And I hope that the buffering factors on both sides will sort of keep this within the band of the last 30 or 40 years, as opposed to getting into unnecessary conflict that can make things difficult all around. Finally, on my exhortation to Americans, Richmond people, Osher people, and students and rising Americans, as a grizzled, jaded, hard-drinking journalist, I usually poo-poo anything about human contacts, blah, 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 this sort of people-to-people interactions. On the other hand, I think it really does matter in tangible ways that as many people in the U.S. have been exposed to China and Chinese, vice versa, in the U.S., as have been the last 30 years, and I think it makes a real difference and needs to be encouraged. Several examples. Within China, you can see very different layers of people with their exposure to the Western world. The least exposed is the People's Liberation Army, which is suspicious of outside contact, although the U.S. Navy is trying to deal with them, and therefore is probably the most xenophobic of them all. Next out on the layers of the onion is the political leadership, which is suspicious as generally not Western trained, although the children of almost all the top leaders are now at Harvard, Yale, Richmond, Oxford, wherever, which I think is a good thing. And you go out several more layers. The business community is very intertwined. The financial leadership of China is 99.9% Western trained. They're from Berkeley, they're from Cambridge, they're from, you name the Western institution. That has its bad sides, as we know about our financiers and economists, but it has its good sides in that it's very easy for them to work with the rest of the world. After the financial crisis 4 or 5 years ago now, the part of the cooperation that worked most easily is financial between the U.S. and China, because these people spoke the same language literally and conceptually, and they'd been classmates and all the rest. And I think it matters on the Chinese side, it matters on the U.S. side too, because most Americans I know in China, they have their grievances. We had a grievance every day we talk over. And our motto when we had dinner each night was, well, it's always more interesting than horrible. But there are always horrible things. But we ended up liking it. And we're liking the people. And most Americans and most foreigners there end up liking the people. And almost any American who's spent time there ends up thinking, this is a country that has way more problems than we do. These are people we basically like. And this is a place we need to take seriously, but not be afraid of. To be afraid of the place that's siphoning out the gasoline into the airplane, I empathize with that guy more than I'm afraid of him. I respect his ability to get things done. So I think the more that Americans can learn Chinese language, as Deb has propounded, and be familiar with Chinese culture, as Rose has done with this wonderful ChinaFest, and just spend time there, the more they will feel comfortable with the strengths, weaknesses, foibles, and attractions of a country that deserves to do better and that we should be able to live with in a reasonable way. So taking China seriously without being afraid of it is part of the mission of the ChinaFest, and that's why we are very glad to be here as part of your festivities. So thanks for having us.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, Deborah, for a very enlightening introduction to a program that I think is a great way to kick off ChinaFest here in Richmond. And I think that you've helped to encapsulate both from the linguistic side and also the cultural side what I think some of the greatest challenges are while we're waiting for the first cards to come up. One of the things that both I think linguistically but also culturally is very important for us to stop and examine is the difference between a political system of communism, totalitarianism, however you want to describe it, and a capitalist society that has captured China at its very roots. And I think that both from a standpoint of how people look at themselves internally, but how it actually operates. I'd love to hear your perspectives, because I think if there is a part that's not understood by the West, particularly Americans, it's they look at China, it's a communist country. They have no idea. Tell us a little bit about your experiences having lived there and looking at this, both the political side, but the capitalism.
Everybody have
Yeah. Do you want to do the theoretical part?
So Deb has graciously invited me to do the dry, boring theory. Then she that she can give some stories. I think that most people who have spent time in China think this is a very naturally capitalistic culture, that it's a miracle that for several decades Mao was able to suppress it and damp down people's built-in, I resist saying that any trait is innate, but there's a real appetite for commerce among people. And I think that something that really, the part of Deng Xiaoping's liberalization 30 years ago, my theoretical offering, would be that would be placing first emphasis upon experimentation and trying a lot of different things and seeing what works. And so you'll notice if you read about Chinese development, you always hear about experimental zones for this or that. And if you go to Shenzhen, which is just north of Hong Kong, which 30 years ago was just a little tiny village, and now is a city of 15 or 16 million people, where most of your electronics are made, that was an experimental zone that Deng Xiaoping set up to see what would happen if we let foreign investment in. It was as far away from Beijing as it was possible to get within the Chinese mainland, and it worked there, so they tried it elsewhere. And so I think the experimental pragmatism of Deng Xiaoping has allowed him economically and in other ways to be very experimental while also being ruthlessly controlling on the parts of political power they needed. So I'll give one other theoretical point. Conceptually, it's really hard for me as an American. It took me a long time to accept the idea that you could have a combination of chaos and control. In the old Soviet Union, in the old China, in the old East Germany, everything was controlled. In Nigeria and various places I've been, everything seemed pretty chaotic. In China, lots of things are chaotic, and a few crucial things are controlled. The press is controlled. Political competition is really controlled. Dissidents are controlled. A few things are controlled, the rest, whatever.
Okay. One of the things that Jim, can you hear me? Is this working? Yes? Oh, okay. That we really appreciated about being in China was every single Chinese person we got to know had an incredibly deep, rich, personal story. And they were brave, they were creative, they were fearless, they were take no prisoners. And in our age group, and they were entrepreneurial. In our age group, we of course knew a lot of people, and one of my favorite people is the woman I met in Shanghai, who was a teenager during the Cultural Revolution. She was upset because all her friends were being sent off to the countryside to be re-educated and work in factories and so forth. And her assignment was to stay in Shanghai and work in a textile factory, which of course she didn't want to do. She wanted to kind of be out there with everybody else because it was, in a way, exciting, even though you were split up from your family. So she said, okay, if this is my fate, if I'm going to be in this boring textile factory, I'm going to learn as much as I possibly can about being a seamstress, sewing, textiles, how you design clothes, everything. And she told me this because she was my seamstress. You know, every Western woman who goes to China finds somebody to make clothes for them. Yes. No, it's not this. I'm not wearing her dress today.
She didn't make this suit, but she wore the suit. I should have. She made the suit.
I should have worn her dress.
Yes.
At any rate, what was really interesting was she was describing her background and her story to me, and then just laughing and saying, "And can you believe it? Look at me now. I've got this capitalist business going on out of my apartment here in Shanghai, supplying everything to the Westerners." She was one example out of the 500 million Chinese we met. The young girls who live in the villages and know to get out, they have to start a business. Everyone starts a business. They all become nail salon girls in Shanghai. Today, I was listening to an interview on the internet from a young woman who had graduated from the university in 1989. And she had been studying foreign languages and wanted to go into the diplomatic service or something. But she said during that year, nobody got to do what they wanted to do because it was 1989. And she was sent off to a factory in Dalian where she had to check off trucks coming in and out of the factory. She said, "This is not for me. I'm going to Maryland." There was a disconnect. I don't know how she got to Maryland, but today she owns the Chesapeake Candle Company that she founded. And it's just one story after another of, I've got a problem, okay, deal with it, I'm gonna go start a business. And so, no whining allowed.
How much, as we're waiting for the cards, how much of this is changing now, though, with the generation that did not, because Tiananmen Square is 24 years ago, and the whole business with Chairman Mao is another generation before that, practically. How much is changing from what you see in China with the folks who are 25, 30, and younger?
So 2 answers on this. One is that part of my standard spiel I didn't give is how important generations are in China, because the experience has been so dramatically different in 5-year intervals. So people who are 25 and younger, they've only known a rich and ascendant China. Almost all of them are only children, so they have all the pluses and minuses. More of them are men than women. Not many of the high school and college age students today even know about the Tiananmen episode, because it really is not part of the curriculum or public knowledge in any way. But in a sense, that doesn't matter, because there's an entirely different axis of what they are frustrated about or unsatisfied with, and it has to do with wage inequalities and the government's control of social media, and how the Weibo users, which is Twitter, stay ahead of the censors, and things like pollution, which has become a real touchstone. Mm-hmm. And university, sort of justice at university. For example, there was almost a riot about 2 years ago. I described this in my book, where at a relatively provincial university, a party boss would send at the end of each school day his own personal helicopter to take his daughter back home. She would land on the soccer field, and this finally got people's back up.
Okay, that's what I was going to say.
Well, Deborah, from a linguistics standpoint, again, with the younger people, first time I went to China, we went to China 20 or so years ago, the number of people that could speak any English, even hello, was limited to an incredible few. Today, particularly in the big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, and even in places like going into the Gansu province, you have so many people that speak English beyond just fluently. In fact, their accents, and they've never been to the United States. Yeah. How does that impact not only the worldview, but the interaction that they have with the outside, particularly with us here in the West?
Yeah, it's one of the great prizes that we have is that everyone wants to learn English, and the Chinese, love American culture, Western culture, pop culture, and the kids just lap it up and know the words to movies and to songs and to videos of all sorts. English is one of the 5 mandatory examinations you have to take to get into the university. So a surprising number are really, really good. On the other hand, out in the villages, you have this problem because the ones who are far out don't have English teachers who are that good, so they don't do as well on the exams, and then they go to the regional universities where they have to actually pay more. There's less financial support for these regional universities than the big city universities, so you have a kind of split thing going on that that continues and is exacerbated. Again, we also found that the Chinese are just so creative about learning English, because if you really want to do it, so many told us, well, I learned it from TV shows, and I think I really struggle to try to keep up my Chinese here. I watch CCTV, and I watch cartoons in Chinese, and I watch sitcoms in Chinese, but it is really hard to do, and it's amazing to me that they learn so much.
We can tell the story of River Lou if there's a break in the action. She learned from some. Yeah. Oh, so the story of River Lou. What was there was an American sitcom 5 or 6 years ago with a really skinny woman star. She was a lawyer. What was this?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Ally McBeal. So we met when I was going in some coal mine. My guide was a woman named River Lou who spoke just native English, and she had learned it entirely in her village in Shenzhen from watching Ally McBeal. And this is a woman who's getting one of many Chinese women getting ready to run the world. She's now Duke Energy's representative in China. She took us to the concert of the Eagles in Beijing. That's a whole separate story. We went with Don Henley on a tour of a coal conversion site the next day. So.
And the Eagles, by the way, are the most popular singing group ever in China, because they were the first Western group to go to China.
And they're big in China.
Yeah, they're big in China. We were in one of the Olympic basketball auditoriums with, I don't know, 19,000 people or something, and they were all standing up singing the lyrics to
Great.
California
Hotel
Desperado.
Yeah.
First time I ever heard Johnny Tillotson, who was a big hit in America. Do people remember Johnny Tillotson back 50 years ago? Nobody? In China, Hong Kong in particular, Johnny Tillotson's a huge hero, plays to huge crowds. And I'm listening. We were on the street hearing what's his greatest hit, but y'all would know it. And it's like, who's that? And they were singing the lyrics. It's fabulous. We're going to turn to questions now, because we have lots of questions. In fact, unfortunately, we probably have many more than we can possibly address tonight. I'm going to stay for a moment just with the language side and how this and I'll read 2 questions and have y'all address them in a similar fashion. I feel embarrassed that so many Chinese speak English, but so very few Westerners can speak Chinese. How do you feel? Likewise, China has 2 dialects. Will this be changed to common language for nationality? Since Chinese is difficult for Chinese to learn, could a new language, English, replace it? And obviously this has more far-reaching meaning than just language and such.
What's the first question again? Oh, are we embarrassed? Yes, I'm embarrassed actually that not more Westerners speak Chinese, but I'm also really hopeful, have a lot of hope about this. We noticed a huge difference from when we left in 2006 to when we came back, 3 or 4 years later, about the amount of Chinese that is taught in U.S. schools. And now there were, I think, 2 schools in D.C. that taught Chinese to little kids. Now they're everywhere. Chinese is being taught everywhere, and interestingly, there's a huge effort by the Chinese government called the Confucius Institutes, which sends out a virtual army of young Chinese teachers for free to communities and universities around the world, and including the U.S., to teach set up little cultural institutes and also teach in schools, depending town to town how they'll have them. Elementary schools or high schools or also universities. So I see it, you know, it was French in our day. Now it's becoming, and then it was Japanese for a while. Now it's becoming Chinese, definitely. So I have a lot of hope that it's going that way. And also, since there are 100,000 Chinese exchange students in the U.S. now, it's got to mingle and mix it up a little bit somehow.
So is China going for English?
Is China going for English? No, definitely not going for English. I mean, they will learn English, but it will be as a second language. China has done more to plan and engineer their language than any other country in the world ever. I state that just as something.
Wow.
And has been more successful at it. There are, you know, 8 or 9 major language families in China, 50 different dialects, and yet it was decreed after many kinds of fights that they should choose one, and it was going to be Mandarin. And starting in about 1950, Mandarin was the lingua franca, and you learned it in school. They kind of massaged and eased up on the character system so that all of the peasants who were illiterate at the turn of the century could learn some Chinese too, and to learn the Chinese characters as well. So the idea that you can say something in China and that it will happen is much more likely to happen than not. So if you say it's going to be Mandarin and we're all going to speak it, then everyone will speak it. So even at one point, they argued about which language it should be. They'll speak Cantonese in Hong Kong forever, but not Mandarin. And even Esperanto came up as one of the possibilities of what the language should be. That didn't go very far, we know, but okay. So no, it'll always be there.
Different sort of question. We tend to measure China's progress from a Western perspective. How does China seem to measure progress?
I think the literal and technical answer is there's all these indicators of GDP growth. Will it be 7.8 or 7.6% next year? And the provincial totals on corn or whatever. Those things are of extremely low reliability, in my view. That one of the reasons there was such mass starvation during the Great Leap Forward years of the 50s is that quotas were set in the provinces for a certain amount of wheat produced, and they had to say, oh yeah, we're producing that much, and they'd ship out all the wheat they produced, and the people would starve because they had to make it look as if they were meeting their quotas. So there is the numbers play a large role, as they do in any rising economy, but I think the measure that matters to the government, most of the people, is this one, is if you look at the majority of families in China, are their lives better than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Until, say, if you ask that question as of, say, 2005, 2006, the answer was obvious. People's lives were unrecognizably better off than they were 30 years ago. They were clearly better off than 10 years ago and measurably better off than 4 or 5 years ago. And the challenge now is whether the fraction of people who answer that in the negative is increasing. So I think that whether people have a materially and in other ways better life has been the measure.
Yeah, that's okay.
Great, okay. How worried are you about the only child behavior, and will it influence their society and politics?
Well, the little princelings, it is odd. And, you know, there is something a little strange about an entire country now of only children growing up. They're overdosed on attention. They're overdosed on pressure to perform. Especially the boys, I think, aren't dealt with as kind of strictly as the girls. So the psychological factor is there. However, there's a lot of, you see it even in the way people address each other and call each other. in the places where we lived, you know, if you hear one of the staff calling up the maintenance man to say, you got to go up and check our apartment because something's bad is going on, they'll call them little sister or little brother or big brother. There's a familiarity among friendships that is really strong, you know, walking arm in arm, being my best friend, and even the nomenclature of calling your friends your sisters or your cousins. I think that's some effort to kind of create closeness and make up for the absence of having a brother or sister to fight with. I don't know, it's probably, it's a little bit of a problem, but not as much of a problem as if there were way too many more people there.
Clearly. We're going to take a turn to politics and the military. Given your comments about the Chinese military, should there be concern that the military could dictate policy toward the West?
I think there should be concern and attention about the question of civilian control of the military in China, because we know how much this is a both fundamental and contested issue in the United States. Of civilian control of the military is essential, and we build it in various ways. But so up through all the fabric of the U.S. military, there are civilian leaders at the top of each decision tree. Of course, ultimately with the president. The Chinese. Point one is the People's Liberation Army, as many of you probably know, is not the army of the country of China. It's the army of the Communist Party of China. So it's the party's army. When the president, the person who's in charge in China, the big man in China, now Xi Jinping, is the big man by virtue of having three jobs simultaneously. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, the President of the country, and the Chairman of the Military Commission. You know, the last is a crucial thing. And apart from that top of the pyramid connection between the president and the military, there's no sort of, the rest of the connection is mainly with the Communist Party representative in each military branch. There'll be a Communist Party apparatchik, I forget the official term, but apparatchik would be the functional term in this Air Force branch or in this Navy branch or whatever. So I think there is, anybody watching Chinese politics is always alert to how much does the civilian control, what is their degree of leverage within the military, because that's always a question. And then there are efforts from the outside world, notably the U.S. Navy, to try to build actual links with their counterparts in the PLA to have the same fabric of connections and familiarity that exist in the financial ministries, the environmental ministries, the aerospace ministries. In the last 10 years, Chinese airlines have been statistically safer than U.S. airlines because there was a Colgan crash 4 years ago, and China's gone a long time without a fatal crash. That's because the Chinese aviation system is essentially run by Americans. You know, the FAA and the NTSB have interleaved themselves, and the Navy is trying to find ways to build similar familiarity with the PLA so that in episodes like this hacking episode, you don't have to wonder, is this government directed, is it military directed, is it just teenagers or whatever, or the anti-satellite shoot down a couple of years ago, or the skirmishes in the South China Sea, which are genuinely dangerous, of having China and Japan come to, there's such kind of braggadocio on both sides now, you can imagine something escalating there. So it's an issue. And
related to that, why the preoccupation with small territorial disputes, like in the South China Sea?
If you ask a sophisticated Chinese, say, student of American history that question, he would say, what about Pearl Harbor? You know, what about 54-40 or fight? What about all these other things in American history where remote territory has been important? The larger thing which has really struck us, and we've often discussed and written about, is that over the last quarter century that we've been involved in China, one of the most startling changes is how much more anti-Japanese hate propaganda there is in China, and how many more young people just say, well, we have problems with America, but boy, we really hate Japan. You know, there's people whose grandparents were in the war. And this has been convenient for the Chinese government as sort of a shunt for dissatisfaction. It's been sort of stupidly convenient on the Japanese side of not wanting to deal with World War II repercussions, and it really means the two sides are really cruising for a bruising on these objectively meaningless islands, I think.
I'm going to turn to the environment. How damaging to the earth is pollution in China, and what is being done about it? You mentioned China's use of coal. Can you comment on the role of nuclear power for their energy needs? And I loved your slide of the chunks of coal, which of course, I think my first winter visit to China, down to Xi'an, the daytime was as dark as the nighttime because everybody burned coal. And the dramatic change has been dramatic, it just hasn't been dramatic enough.
Right.
And how does that impact from what you see and what you've experienced, and also living in China for 3 years, as opposed to those of us who come and go often and aren't suffering as much?
When you talk about the living, and Jorge and Paula now too.
Yeah, well, the living there, it becomes an oppressive, depressing factor in your life. We used to do this kind of measure in the morning before we'd look out, open the curtains and look out the window, kind of say, okay, how much does your chest hurt? Well, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, and then look out. And that really wasn't even a very good measure because the really hurtful particulates are so small that you can't see them. But nonetheless, there did seem to be some kind of correlation with what you see. It is getting so much worse. You know, even 3 years ago when we were there, one time I remember walking over a flyover with one of my Chinese friends, and I was astonished when I looked down this big road and could only see a quarter of a mile. And I said something to her about, you know, how can you stand this? I just blurted it out. And she said, I'm just so busy. I see what is right in front of my hands, or right in front of my face. I don't look out beyond me. But now I think it's changing so much. We have, among our expat friends who lived in China since we did and before then, almost to a person, they're starting to say now, I think I'm going to go home. You know, the kids haven't played outside for recess in three weeks, or it's 2 months, or whatever it is. Another one's starting to get asthma, or our doctor said, is it the 5-year rule?
Yeah.
Or the 3-year rule?
The 5-year rule.
The 5-year rule, right.
If you stay in China for 5 years or more, you become actuarially Chinese in terms of your life expectancy. If you stay for less than 5 years, you return to your previous trend.
So it's a huge factor, and it affects your everyday life.
A couple of points here. First, on the air pollution, as Deb was saying, and as Alex was saying, that a generation ago, the air looked worse in many cities because they were burning coal, and it was large particulates that you could see, like soot. And that was largely corrected, but now there's been, just in the last 4 or 5 years, increase in the small particulate pollution, which is much more damaging. If you look at a Twitter feed for something called @BeijingAir, this is a monitor on the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, that for a number of years was the only site in China that was reporting publicly the small particulate readings. And in our day, we got really upset when the reading got, say, 350 or 400, which was like life-threatening emergency on the U.S. EPA scale, and where most readings in the U.S. would be 20 or 31 or something like that. In the last 2 or 3 months, there have been readings in Beijing in the 700s and 800s, which is like inside a forest fire. You know, just is something that is unendurable. And I think the reaction from the Chinese media, Chinese politicians suggests that on the energy front, the argument I heard many times and took seriously. There was a good friend of mine who worked for the guy, the billionaire air conditioner maker. And he was saying, I met him in his apartment in Beijing, which is a very nice apartment. He said, my father was a laborer in Xi'an. Once a month, he would go to the little store and have a beer from a refrigerator, because our village had one little place for the generator for a refrigerator. Now I have refrigerator, I have fluorescent lights and all that. Everybody in China wants that, and they want it, and they deserve it as everybody does. And he and other people would say, okay, do you want us to have nuclear plants? Fine. Do you want us to dam rivers? Fine. Do you want us to burn coal? Fine. And just anything they do, like the rest of the world, puts on its burden. The pollution threat of China is mainly to China's own people. The groundwater, the heavy metals and all that. The carbon emissions, like those every place else, are a threat to the entire world. And I think that China and the US will solve this problem together, address this problem together, or there's no hope for anybody, I think.
I'm going to close with a combination of questions all put to one, because I think this is an appropriate place to bring us back to look at the future as it relates, particularly between China and the United States. I'll read a couple of questions and then wrap this all together. In the past 10 years or so, it appears that China is allowing a lot of its citizens to leave and emigrate. What is the reason for this? And I'd expand that to what comes next, since so many well-educated Chinese and their children send their children to U.S. schools. How many come home, and are they changed, and will they change society? And I'll wrap this up then with an all-encompassing question for you, and that is, with our two countries and the paths that we're taking, an ever-expanding China, a global world that's becoming increasingly smaller, how do these things, from your perspective, your experience with China, how does, in the Chinese perspective of the world, how do you see, looking out 10, 20, or maybe 50 years, the world as you see it?
This is why we're married.
I'm reminded of, you know, the predictions are hard to make, especially about the future line, but I will. So on the why are they letting people emigrate? In general, the watchword of the Chinese government over the last 20 or 30 years has been to control things only that they feel they have to control. If they don't have to control something, they stop controlling it. And emigration was, I think it's been quite a while since they've sort of had the political emigre type fear. And most of the time, apart from famous dissidents, we'll talk about them in a moment, if somebody wants to leave the country, probably China's better off if they're not there. So I think they have the sophistication that they let people leave. The main reason for control until recently was sort of currency flow and just trying, and there's a whole war chest, obviously, of foreign reserves the government has. As that has relaxed too, just more and more, it seemed like a way to allow Chinese people to enjoy themselves, to spend their wealth. So there's no real reason to control it anymore. The fascinatingly similar but different question of people sending their children and their money overseas permanently, you know, not as tourists, but as real markers overseas, that is something often discussed in China and as a sobering phenomenon. I mean, suppose that the members of our Supreme Court and the 20 most senior senators and the president and vice president all had their children enrolled in Tsinghua and Fudan and Peking U, and those kids were thinking they might spend their lives there. You think, well, how worldly, but also it would make you, what does that suggest about your own institutions, your own sense of faith? So I think that there is, many people in China are worried about the signs of fortunes being sent overseas, families being sent overseas. One of the most outspoken proponents of the China über alles theory, a guy I won't name in Shanghai, but if you follow this, you'll know who I'm talking about, says this is the model that dominates everybody. He has a big ranch in Napa where the rest of his family lives. And he made his money as a venture capitalist in California, and he's, I will be surprised if he's in Shanghai and not Napa 20 years from now. The longer term view, I think, again, I'm by profession, I'm a cynic and somebody looking for the imperfections and the things that don't, that are worrisome. But I think it's been impressive how well China and the U.S. on a governmental level, a business level, and a personal level have managed the last 30 plus years. And I can see a sort of bleeding together of the cultures increasingly as you have more of the students here, as more of your students go over there, as you have art shows from there, as you take your art shows abroad, because the people usually when they get together like each other as opposed to the reverse. So I hope that we see a sort of de facto continued, not Chimerica union, but just the two countries finding ways to get along together. The dystopian view is war between China and Japan, the US gets sucked into environmental hell, the PLA breaks loose, there's some kind of tumultuous overthrow in China. I hope none of that happens.
Me too.
Yeah. But I'll also say we feel like we have to keep going back there at least a couple times a year just to stay in touch and to stay refreshed, and we're going to go there next week. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I would like to say thank you to Deborah and James for a fabulous overview. And they will be out here in the lobby, and I would highly recommend the books. In fact, I've just finished James's book last week on a plane, of all places, coming back from the West Coast. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.